another good evening, and I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Rosalind Rawnsley. Some of you will have been introduced before, but she is a descendant of the Franklin family, and really I think this is quite a momentous talk where she will be speaking about John Ray and Sir John Franklin as well. But it's terrific to have you here, and there you go, Rosalind.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Andrew.
you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you very much to Fionn for playing Farewell to Stromness, which of course was written by Peter Maxwell Davies for a very different sort of occasion. But when the Franklin expedition left Stromness to go to the Arctic, it was indeed a farewell, a last farewell. And so the composer sent me a copy of that, the piano version of it, which it was written many years ago for Christmas as a surprise. And whenever I'm feeling sad, I try and struggle through it on the piano to remind me of my beloved Orkney. I live in France, but my spiritual home has been Orkney for a long time. So it's a great privilege and pleasure for me to be back here, and thank you very much to Andrew Appleby and the John Ray Society for making it possible for me to come over and talk to you. Well, now, some of you were not here, but in Stromness last night, I believe, and some of you were not. So just very briefly to recap, yesterday I talked about the historical background to Arctic exploration, which goes back a very long way to the time of Elizabeth I, if not earlier than that. But this evening we move on a little on John Ray's birthday indeed, and I have entitled this evening's talk The Last Link, Ray and Franklin, a Tale of Tragedy and Heroism. It is indeed the final chapter of a story which I began in October 2023 when, on behalf of the Stromness Museum, I gave an account of Sir John Franklin's fatal last expedition in search of a navigable sea route to the north of what is now Canada to link the Atlantic to the Bering Strait and the Pacific Ocean. In the second instalment yesterday, in order to put the expedition in context, as I just said, I discussed the historical background and the reasons why the discovery of such a route, if one did indeed exist, was considered, for reasons which evolved over time, to be so important. So now, at last, appears centre stage Dr. John Ray, who, with his customary patience, has been waiting all this time in the wings. We did console him a little bit with a suitable libation this morning in the kirkyard here. As the Bible has it, a prophet is not without honour except in his own country and among his own people. An observation made by Jesus which is as true today as when it was quoted nearly 2,000 years ago by the author of St. Matthew's Gospel. Here in Orkney we are, of course, among John Ray's own people, in his own country, where he is indeed still honoured, and to you as Orcadians, and many of you, I imagine, as members of the society dedicated to educating the public about the life and achievements of John Ray, I would not presume to try to add to your knowledge and expertise. So, I would like now just to discuss the considerable role which he played in the search for Franklin. Ray's astonishing achievements in Arctic exploration and his survival in conditions inconceivable to most of us were due in no small part to his having learned how to live like a native from the Inuit, for whom he had a great respect and affection. More about that in due course. As Leslie Neatby, in his authoritative account of the search for Franklin, published in 1970, tells us, many months elapsed after the expedition sailed from Stromness on the 3rd of June 1845 for the Arctic before any anxiety about its progress was expressed. It was well known that the Arctic was normally navigable only for a couple of months during the brief northern summer and therefore it was most unlikely that the expedition could be completed in a single season. Even in the early months of the following year, no particular concern was being expressed in official quarters at the absence of news, rather different from today. However, by 1847, when there had still been no sightings of either ship or of any members of the crews, some anxiety did begin to be felt. Those who had experience of the Arctic, including Sir John Ross among others, considered that if there was still no news by the end of that year, it was highly likely that Franklin was in serious trouble. Ross, although now in his 70th year, informed the Admiralty that he had promised Franklin that he would personally lead a relief expedition if there was still no news by the end of 1847. Well, by the beginning of 1848, anxiety really began to be felt in official quarters, and plans were formed for a relief expedition. HMS Plover, carrying mail for the members of the expedition, was to be sent to the Bering Strait between Siberia and Alaska, whence her boats could be used to scour the coast of the Arctic shore of Alaska, while a second boat expedition would search the coast further east between the Mackenzie and the Coppermine rivers. This plan of operations would, it was thought, cover all the area of Franklin's intended course. Though straightforward enough on paper, this plan did not allow for the fact that Franklin might have been diverted from his intended course by heavy ice. I don't know if that shows on that map where the area which is normally or was always filled with ice for almost all the year round. Well, those with first-hand experience of the Arctic considered that this course of action was too simplistic and made their views known to the Admiralty. Others weighed in with further suggestions. Overland expeditions should leave caches of food at strategic points. Further searches should be conducted via the great rivers which drained into the Arctic Sea, while other ships should be dispatched by sea, taking different courses than those of Franklin's original intention. Though, of course, nobody could have known it at the time, all this was too little and too late. Between 1847 and 1854, numerous expeditions were sent out by the British government under the command of various Arctic veterans, and in the autumn of 1850, there were no less than 15 vessels engaged in the search. 2 ships, which were icebound for 4 successive winters, did eventually return safely. 2 others had to be abandoned, though their crews were fortunately rescued. But in spite of the best efforts of all these expeditions, no trace of either Erebus or Terror or of their crews was found. They had seemingly vanished into thin air. In the absence of any means of communication other than personal contact or the leaving of written messages, various other means of contact were tried. Since the terrain was extremely difficult due to the shifting ice and snow, to cover physically the whole vast area of the Arctic was, of course, impracticable. Other means of communication with the lost expedition were therefore tried. Hundreds of balloons were sent up from the rescue ships, with information about the location of caches of food and supplies and the whereabouts of rescue ships. Thousands of printed dispatches were scattered, and other attempts to make contact involved the use of rockets, flashing lights, gunshots, horns, and drums. Carrier pigeons were dispatched with messages, and messages were sent with Inuit hunters met with during the search. However, because of the language barrier and in the absence of interpreters, the difficulty of communication with the Inuit, it was realized that there was little chance of these messages actually reaching the destinatees. Other more esoteric and tangible means of communication were therefore tried. Among them was the use of Arctic foxes, known to travel long distances in search of nourishment. they would often gather food near human settlements in the hope of scavenging discarded food. So somebody had the bright idea of embossing special collars with information about rescue efforts to be fitted to captured foxes, which would then be released in the hope that they might be spotted and trapped or shot by members of the lost expedition. Another idea was embossed postal or rescue buttons with the same information, which were given to Inuit hunters who prized them highly and found many uses for them. One, indeed, used as the bowl for a pipe, was found 10 years later and several hundred miles away by an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company. It is now apparently in the collection of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. Well, as we now know, of course, all these ingenious rescue efforts were in vain, and no trace of the missing men or their ships could be found. Years passed, and even to the most optimistic members of the general public, who had been assiduously following the story all this time, the realization gradually came to be accepted that Franklin and all the members of the ill-fated expedition must have lost their lives. In the end, more than 30 expeditions were dispatched to search for traces of Franklin and the 129 members of his crews who had set off so full of hope from Stromness. Eventually, even the powers that be, after so much money, effort and resources had been vainly expended in the search, were forced reluctantly to come to the same conclusion. It was officially declared that it must be assumed that not only Franklin, but the whole of his crew had perished. Their names were then removed from the Navy list. Officially, the matter was now closed. Well, almost the only one who never gave up hope was Lady Franklin. Despite there having been no news whatsoever of the whereabouts of her husband, his ships and his crew for 10 years now, she had clung to the hope that against all the odds he must have been successful in his quest and would somehow, someday, return triumphant. She had badgered the government to send out search expeditions. She had written, among others, to Lord Palmerston, to the Tsar of Russia, and to the President of the United States, not Mr. Trump, asking for help in the search. The latter had responded warmly and had supported a New York merchant, Mr. H. Grinnell, who fitted and sent out 2 search expeditions in 1850 and 1853, and kept up a regular correspondence with Lady Franklin for many, many years thereafter. Lady Franklin herself organized and financed several search expeditions, but all in vain. The whole sorry tale of search expeditions involving many Arctic veterans, politicians, and the Admiralty, backbiting, jealousy, and misjudgment, and finally, just bad luck and bad weather, has been well documented. Theories of what might have happened abounded, and in the event, of course, were all proved wrong. Well, where does John Ray fit into all of this? Ray had been brought up to the outdoor life here in Orkney from his earliest years. As he recounted in an article reprinted in the Orkney Herald in 1887, by the time I was 15, I had become so seasoned as to care little about cold or wet, had acquired a fair knowledge of boating, was a moderately good climber among rocks, and not a bad walker for my age, sometimes carrying a pretty heavy load of game or fish on my back. These accomplishments, as he remarks, were of great service to him in later life after he joined the Hudson's Bay Company. His first posting, having completed his medical training, was a surgeon on a summer voyage to Moose Factory, the HBC base in North America, the southern end of Hudson's Bay. He evidently acquitted himself very well, as he was offered a contract by the company and ended up by remaining at Moose Factory for about 10 years. He cut his teeth as an explorer on an extended leave visit to friends and relations, and apparently covered a considerable part of the journey on snowshoes, an accomplishment which he had already mastered and of which he was destined to make good use in following years. He early attracted the notice of Sir George Simpson, colonial governor of the HBC, who wrote to him in 1844, "An idea has entered my mind that you are one of the fittest men in the country to conduct an expedition for the purpose of completing the survey of the northern coast that remains untraced. As regards the management of the people and endurance of toil, either in walking, boating, or starving, I think you are better adapted for this work than most of the gentlemen with whom I am acquainted in the country." Well, while in the event that first expedition seems to have been cancelled, Rae did, during that winter of 1844 to 45, undertake a marathon journey of about 1,200 miles entirely on snowshoes. 2 months of continuous travelling, as he was to write later. R.M. Ballantyne, the Scottish writer of children's fiction, who spent 5 years working for the Hudson's Bay Company, wrote of a meeting with Rae on the Winnipeg River in September 1845. "In the afternoon we met another canoe in which we saw a gentleman sitting. This strange sight set us all speculating as to who it could be, for we knew that all the canoes accustomed annually to go through these wilds had long since passed. Both canoes made towards a flat rock that offered a convenient spot for landing on, and the stranger introduced himself as Dr. Rae. He was on his way to York Factory for the purpose of fitting out at that post an expedition for the survey of the small part of the North American coast left unexplored, which will then prove beyond a doubt whether or not there is a communication by water between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans round the north of America. Dr. Rae appeared to be just the man for such an expedition. He was very muscular and active, full of animal spirits, and had a fine intellectual countenance. He was considered to be one of the best snowshoe walkers in the service, was also an excellent rifle shot, and could stand an immense amount of fatigue. He does not proceed as other expeditions have done, namely with large supplies of provisions and men, but merely takes a very small supply of provisions and 10 or 12 men. Well, this last was to be a significant observation, as we shall see. As you will know, of course, as an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company and engaged in the fur trade in North America, Rae had regular dealings with the Inuit, with whom he was on good terms. Unlike most Europeans, including, unfortunately, the members of the fated Franklin expedition, he had learned the Inuit survival techniques, and when on the company's business, was indeed able to live like a native. If Franklin, on his earlier overland expeditions to the Canadian Arctic, had done the same, his story might well have been very different. It is easy, of course, to be wise after the event. In the mid-19th century, when the Royal Navy was at the height of its prestige and influence, the suggestion that any members of the senior service might have gone native would have been inconceivable. John Rae, not being a member of the service and having been brought up in an entirely different milieu, would have had no such inhibitions. Some years earlier, in 1836, the Hudson's Bay Company had entrusted to two of its officers, Messrs. Dease and Simpson, the task of examining the unexplored part of the North American coastline. In so doing, they succeeded in completing a considerable length of hitherto blank space on the map. However, they failed to clarify two important points. Was Boothia an island or a peninsula? And was King William Land also an island or likewise a part of the mainland? The answer to these questions remained unsolved for several years, until in 1844 it was decided that the HBC should organize a further expedition under the leadership of one of its officers to discover the answers. Well, Dr. John Rae, who had by now more than proved his worth as an explorer, was an obvious choice. If, as was hoped, Boothia was found indeed to be an island separated from the continent by a strait, and that there was a continuous stretch of coastline from the south side of Fiore and Hecla Strait round the south end of the Gulf of Boothia to the land on the south side of the hypothetical strait, Rae would not only have completed the survey of the North American coastline, but would also at last have discovered the fabled Northwest Passage. By June 1846, Rae had completed his preparations and set off from York Factory with a party of just 10 men and 2 boats. His orders from Simpson made it clear that he and his team should, as far as possible, be self-sufficient. In other words, by living off the land, by hunting and fishing, a new departure in Arctic exploration, of which in the future Rae would become the foremost practical exponent. In the course of this journey, though unable to settle all the outstanding questions, he did establish beyond doubt that Boothia was not an island. Well, the success of this expedition established Rae's reputation as an Arctic explorer. He returned to England and his official report was published in the Times. He subsequently gave a complete account of the journey in his book Narrative of a Journey to the Shores of the Arctic Sea in 1846 and 1847. Rae's name thereafter became as familiar to the general public as those of Parry, Franklin and Ross. Well, at this point, we retrace our steps to England, where in 1845 it had been hoped that the expedition led by Franklin could settle once and for all the question of the existence or otherwise of a Northwest Passage. No expense should be spared to ensure the success of this venture, and the Hudson's Bay Company was requested to provide every possible assistance if called upon, such assistance to be at the charge of the British government. So thus began the HBC connection with the Franklin expedition and the subsequent search for survivors, or at least news of what had happened, once it was realized that the expedition must have met with disaster. That connection would be maintained intermittently for the next 11 years. By 1847, although there had still been no news, as I said earlier, there was no particular anxiety felt in official circles about the fate of Franklin and his crews. However, the Admiralty did receive 2 communications from Sir John Ross, who evidently was concerned for his old friend. And this prompted their lordships to ask the Arctic veteran Sir James Parry for his opinion, suggesting that he might wish to canvass Sir John Richardson and others for their ideas. Richardson put forward several suggestions, including the dispatch of a search party in boats. Such a party should go down the Mackenzie River, travel east, examining Wollaston Land, Victoria Land and the neighbouring islands, and then return south up the Coppermine River to the north end of Great Bear Lake to overwinter. If the ice conditions did not allow this mission to be completed by the end of the summer, it should be continued in 1849. Well, this suggestion was accepted. Suitable boats were built at Portsmouth and Gosport naval dockyards. 20 men, 15 from the Corps of Royal Sappers and Miners, and 5 Royal Navy seamen were recruited, and men, boats and stores were embarked from England in one of the Hudson's Bay ships. They arrived at York Factory on the west coast of Hudson's Bay in September 1847, where they awaited the arrival of Richardson. As there was still absolutely no news of or reported sightings of either of Franklin's vessels, even by whaling ships returning from Davis Strait in the late autumn, it was decided that Richardson should leave England early in 1848 to join his men. Rae, by now having established his reputation as a capable explorer, ideally qualified for such an undertaking, was proposed by Richardson to be his second in command. The Hudson's Bay Company agreed to release him, and he was instructed to make all the necessary arrangements. Richardson and Rae left Liverpool on the 25th of March 1848, joined up with the boat party from England, and by stages descended the Mackenzie River to the sea, which they reached by the 3rd of August. They then proceeded east along the coast, leaving caches of pemmican and stores at various points, and then by boat and on foot up the Coppermine River to Fort Confidence, which they reached on the 15th of September. During the whole of this journey, no trace whatsoever of Franklin's expedition was found. It was finally agreed between Rae and Richardson that the latter should return to England and that Rae should complete the remainder of the assignment without him. It appears from his reports to Sir George Simpson, though not, of course, in Richardson's book describing the exhibition or in his official report to the Admiralty, that not only did Rae find Richardson irritating and criticised his methods, but also that he found the men recruited from England, quote, the most awkward, lazy and careless set I ever had anything to do with. Richardson, on the other hand, had the greatest admiration for Rae, writing of him in his book, his ability and zeal were unquestionable. He is in the prime of life, and his personal activity and his skill as a hunter fitted him peculiarly for such an enterprise. Rae carried out the detailed orders he had received from Richardson, but still found no trace of Franklin or of his expedition. By November 1849, when Richardson arrived back in England, he found the alarm bells ringing at last, as there was still no news. Franklin's ships had been provisioned for 3 years' absence, and after 4 years, there was still no sign of either ships or crew. The last sighting had been in Baffin Bay at the end of July 1845. Well, it is perhaps timely in these days of instantaneous communication from one side of the globe to the other to recall that at that time the physical difficulties of communication between England and those on the ground in the Arctic regions caused even more delays than there had been hitherto. Rae was in consequence unaware that very detailed orders as to where he should search had been sent out from England in 1850, requiring him to continue the search. He therefore returned to his normal duties at the HBC depots in connection with the fur trade. He did eventually receive these orders, but by then it was too late to put them into action until the following year because of the ice. In 1851, having belatedly at last received his orders, he meticulously carried them out to the letter. Well, this proved in the event to be unfortunate because, as if he had followed the route he had in the meanwhile marked out for himself, he would unquestionably have found out then and there the fate of Franklin's expedition. What a pity. Well, time does not permit me to go into every detail of Rae's search expeditions, which are discussed at length in the fascinating account given in Rae's Arctic Correspondence, published by the Hudson's Bay Record Society. However, it is worth noting that in 1851 he did find 2 pieces of wood washed up on the shore of Parker Bay. One he identified as the end of a small pinewood flagstaff, and the other appeared to be an oak stanchion. These had almost certainly come from one or other of Franklin's ships. The next year, Rae received leave of absence to go to England, where he was awarded the Founder's Gold Medal of the Royal Geographical Society for, as the citation noted, his survey of Boothia under most severe privations in 1848, and for his recent explorations on foot and in boats of the coasts of Wollaston and Victoria lands, by which very important additions have been made to the geography of the Arctic regions. Unfortunately, Rae was not in London to receive the medal in person, having returned home to Stromness, and he was therefore not present to hear the congratulatory speech made by Sir Roderick Murchison, Director General of the British Geological Survey. Sir Roderick, referring to Rae's 1851 expedition, drew the attention of the audience to, quote, the most extraordinary feat, setting out with 2 men only and relying solely for shelter on snow houses, which he taught his men to build. he accomplished a distance of 1,060 miles in 39 days, or 27 miles per day, including stoppages, a feat which has never been equalled in Arctic travelling. The medal was accepted by Sir George Back on behalf of, quote, the honest and unassuming traveller who in his severest trials evinced a judgment always equal to the occasion. But that was not the end of the story. Rae, on his return to London, submitted to the Hudson's Bay Company a plan for the completion of the survey of the northern coasts of America, of which he wrote, "A small portion along the west coast of Boothia is all that now remains unexamined." In 1847, he had established to his own satisfaction that Boothia was part of the mainland, not an island, though some authorities at the time still did not agree that this had been proved. HBC accepted his proposal, so Rae returned to York Factory on Hudson's Bay and set off thence with 2 boats and 13 men. Though, of course, he could not know it at the time, this would prove to be the fateful expedition during which he would at last discover what had happened to Franklin's crew. An Inuit named Munro accompanied him, and on the way north he engaged another Inuit interpreter, Ulig Buck the Younger, who had also taken part in Rae's first expedition. On the 21st of April, Rae received the first intelligence of the demise of some white men, numbering at least 35 to 40, who had starved to death to the west coast of a large river a long distance off, perhaps 10 or 12 days' journey. This information by itself was too vague for him to act upon, but on his return journey, Rae met other Inuits who confirmed the intelligence he had earlier received, and he realized that the river concerned must be Back's Great Fish River, further to the east. Well, the thaw had now started, and this meant that he could not at once make a sledge journey to the river. In any case, even had he succeeded in reaching it, not having a boat, he would have been unable to cross to the other side. So, as Rae saw it, there was no urgency, since his informants had assured him that all the white men were dead and had been dead for 4 years. There was therefore no likelihood of finding any survivors, even had he succeeded in making the journey. Well, in the event, it was most unfortunate that Rae was unable to reach the site where the bodies had been found, as, had he done so, he might have found evidence, including perhaps written records, of the fate of the expedition. In the event, a further 5 years were to elapse before Captain McClintock in 1859 in the Fox, which was a steam yacht chartered by Lady Franklin, reached King William Island, where it seemed most likely that Franklin's ships, or if not the ships, some other traces of his expedition might be found. McClintock's second in command was Lieutenant Hobson, who had earlier served in the Plover. While McClintock searched the east coast of the island, he instructed Hobson to explore by sledge the west coast of the island, where it was most likely that clues might be found. It was therefore Hobson who, dismantling a cairn, at last found the evidence which had been so long sought: a metal cylinder containing a printed navy form with 2 distinct entries. The first entry, dated the 28th of May 1847, gave details of the route which they had sailed, giving the position at which Erebus and Terror had wintered in the ice off Beechey Island, and ended, "Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all well." The second entry, dated the 25th of April 1848, told a different story. 25th of April 1848. HM ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April, 5 leagues northwest of this, having been beset since the 12th of September 1846. The officers and crews, consisting of 105 souls, under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier, landed here. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. Signed, James Fitzjames, Captain, HMS Erebus. And in another hand, start tomorrow, 26 for Backfish River, F.R.M. Crozier, Captain and Senior Officer. A sadder tale was never told in fewer words, as McClintock observed. So, we return now to where we left Dr. Ray in 1854. Ray returned to York Factory at the end of August that year, and the following day composed his report for the Governor. Sir, I have the honour to report for the information of the Governor, Deputy Governor and Committee that I arrived here yesterday with my party all in good health, but from causes which will be explained in their proper place, without having affected the object of the expedition. At the same time, information has been obtained and articles purchased from the natives which prove beyond a doubt that a portion, if not all, of the then survivors of the long-lost and unfortunate party under Sir John Franklin had met with a fate as melancholy and dreadful as it is possible to conceive. 20th of April. The fresh footmarks of an Eskimo with a sledge having been since yesterday on the ice within a short distance of our resting place, the interpreter and 1 man were sent to look for them. After an absence of 11 hours, the men sent in search of Eskimo returned in company with 17 natives. They would give us no information on which any reliance could be placed, and none of them would consent to accompany us for a day or 2, although I promised to reward them liberally. We had barely resumed our journey when we were met by a very intelligent Eskimo driving a dog sledge laden with muskox beef. This man at once consented to accompany us on 2 days' journey, and in a few minutes had deposited his load on the snow and was ready to join us. Having explained my object to him, he said that the road by which he had come was the best for us, and having lightened the men's sledges, we travelled with more felicity. We were now joined by another of the natives who had been absent seal hunting yesterday, but being anxious to see us, had visited our snow house early this morning and then followed up our track. This man was very communicative, and on putting to him the usual questions as to his having seen white men before, or any ships or boats, he replied in the negative, but said that a party of Kabloonians had died of starvation a long distance to the west of where we then were, and beyond a large river. He stated that he did not know the exact place, that he had never been there, and that he could not accompany us so far. The substance of the information then and subsequently obtained from various sources was to the following effect. In the spring, 4 winters past, that was 1850, whilst some Eskimo families were killing seals near the north shore of a large island, named in Arrowsmith's charts King William's Land, about 40 white men were seen travelling in company southward over the ice and dragging a boat and sledges with them. They were passing along the west shore of the above-named island. None of the party could speak the Eskimo language so well as to be understood, but by signs the natives were led to believe the ship or ships had been crushed by ice, and that they were then going to where they expected to find deer to shoot. From the appearance of the men, all of whom with the exception of 1 officer were hauling on the drag ropes of a sledge and were looking thin, they were supposed to be getting short of provisions, and they purchased a small seal or piece of seal from the natives. The officer was described as being a tall, stout, middle-aged man. When their day's journey terminated, they pitched tents to rest in. Ray's report carried on. At a later date, the same season, but previous to the disruption of the ice, the corpses of some 30 persons and some graves were discovered on the continent, and 5 dead bodies on an island near it, about a long day's journey to the northwest of the mouth of a large stream, which can be no other than Back's Great Fish River. Some of the bodies were in a tent or tents, others were under the boat, which had been turned over to form a shelter, and some lay scattered about in different directions. Of those seen on the island, it was supposed that one was that of an officer, chief, as he had a telescope strapped over his shoulders and his double-barreled gun lay underneath him. As far as he had been able to ascertain from the natives, no violence had been offered to these men either before or after death. From the mutilated state of many of the bodies and the contents of the kettles, his report continued, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last dread alternative as a means of sustaining life. In other words, cannibalism. Ray purchased from the Eskimos several artifacts, including monogrammed items of silver cutlery and a medal presented to Sir John Franklin engraved with his name, which proved beyond doubt that the men who had starved to death were indeed the remaining crew of the Franklin expedition who had abandoned ship. Ray obtained leave from the Hudson's Bay Company and returned to England with all haste, arriving at Deal in October 1854, whence he proceeded at once to the Admiralty to make his report. He felt it imperative to do so in order to prevent further fruitless searches in the Arctic in the wrong places. At the same time, he handed over the items he had purchased from the natives. This brief report, giving only the salient points and omitting much of the detail, was written only for my Lords of the Admiralty. Never intended for publication, however, it was unfortunately immediately leaked to the Times. Ray was simply doing what he perceived to be his duty, and in the event it was most unfortunate for him that it was he who had brought back the first fateful news of what had happened to the survivors of Franklin's expedition after they had abandoned ship. Lady Franklin, up to that time, had been on very friendly terms with John Ray and his family. At some point she had presented him with an inscribed silver-plated shotgun, a gun which in less happy times he sold to a customs man, whose descendants, now living in Shetland, apparently still have the gun in their possession. When in 1849, on one of several visits which she made to Orkney in search of news of her husband, Jane Franklin had, according to her diary, described the street in Stromness and the place where she stayed. From the description, Bryce Wilson identified it as the Mason's Arms, now the Orca. She evidently called on Mrs. Ray, John's mother, who she recorded received her in her parlour and insisted on giving her cake and cherry brandy, and on another occasion a present of 4 smoked buffalo tongues. Sophie Craycroft, Sir John Franklin's niece, Lady Franklin's constant companion, wrote at the same time a very long letter to Catherine Rawnsley, my great-great-grandmother, who was another of Sir John's nieces. After a lengthy description of Shetland, she writes, "The people here, as in Shetland, are all kindness, and a special interest attaches to Stromness, from my uncle's being so well known there. He was a fortnight there, when starting upon his first expedition, and the ships were there some days in 1845. Everyone knows him personally, and they will talk of him, which is very trying to my aunt. A man is living there who was with him on one of his expeditions, and who wanted exceedingly to go this time, but his missus wouldn't let him. He goes by no other name than that of Franklin. In Stromness, too, resides the mother of Dr. Ray, the most beautiful old lady I ever beheld." John Ray, for his part, had written in a letter to the governor of the HBC that Lady Franklin was, quote, "frequently with my dear old mother, and made herself a great favourite with everyone by her kindness of manner and affability." Well, when she learned of Ray's report, Lady Franklin was, of course, distraught. After so many years devoted to the search, during which she had clung to the increasingly vain hope that her beloved husband and other members of the expedition would somehow miraculously be found alive, she simply refused to believe the evidence. She particularly could not entertain the appalling notion that upright, honourable, well-trained members of the British Royal Navy could, even in the direst circumstances, engage in the unspeakable, unthinkable act of cannibalism. In a classic case of shoot the messenger, Lady Franklin promptly turned against the hapless Ray. Ray must be wrong. Ray must have been misinformed. Ray did not, after all, himself go to the Great Fish River to see the evidence for himself. Ray was guilty of dereliction of duty, and so on and so on. To protect her husband's reputation and that of his crew, she was determined that Ray should be repudiated. Without the resources of today's social media, she mustered all the influential sources she could to convince the world that Ray had been misled. She enlisted the help of many of the great and good, among them Charles Dickens, then at the height of his fame as a writer and journalist, in a concerted campaign to discredit Ray. Dickens, though a very busy man, dropped everything when sent for by Lady Franklin and was rapidly won over to her point of view. He then proceeded to publish a detailed two-part analysis of the story in his influential publication Home Words, which reached a very wide audience. He castigated the Admiralty for publishing Ray's report without considering the consequences of such a bombshell. However, Dickens did have the grace to acknowledge that Ray had a duty to report what he had been told by the natives, but at the same time strongly criticised him for his conclusions, maintaining that the evidence he had presented did not by any means make the case for cannibalism having been resorted to. The public was outraged on several counts, not the least of which was that it was assumed that Ray had returned to England with indecent haste and only hearsay evidence without first establishing the facts, just in order to claim the reward of £10,000 offered by the British government for news of the fate of the expedition. Well, poor Ray, until he set foot in England, he was quite unaware of the existence of any such a reward. It was likewise considered that despite Ray's assurances to the contrary, it was more than likely that the survivors had been attacked and killed by the Eskimos. There was every reason to suspect treachery and violence. Wild beasts had mutilated the corpses. None of Ray's informants had actually seen the white men, so all the information he had received was second-hand. Furthermore, he had not personally visited the site where it was said the bodies had been found. The Eskimo interpreter may not have perfectly understood the dialect spoken by the natives who claimed to have seen the white men, so he may have passed on misleading information and probably exaggerated. Finally, and most important of all, the religion, courage, discipline, and sense of duty of Franklin's men would certainly have rendered anything so unspeakable as cannibalism unthinkable. This moral improbability would have outweighed what was described as the wild tales of a herd of savages, and so on, and so on, and so on. Poor Ray, we may justifiably say, but also poor Jane Franklin. Well, even today, talk of cannibalism in the so-called civilized world is a topic which, though no longer perhaps as taboo as it was in 1854, still raises a shudder. A century later, in 1957, Michael Flanders and Donald Swan, in their memorable and very funny show, Beyond the Fringe, felt able to include a song entitled The Reluctant Cannibal. The refrain was, "I don't eat people, I won't eat people, eating people is wrong." On the menu for this unfortunate individual was, among other tempting dainties, quote, "roast leg of insurance salesman," if my memory serves me correctly. Well, 100 years earlier, such a song would have been absolutely unacceptable and would have raised a storm of protest instead of a laugh. By contrast, slavery, such a hot topic today, in 1854 was still practiced in America. It was not abolished there officially until 1865. So attitudes change over time. Lady Franklin has often been cast as the villain of the piece, orchestrating the national outcry to discredit John Ray. But perhaps we should cut her a bit of slack. She was absolutely devoted to her sailor husband, who was, as a character, perhaps the antithesis of herself. She had waited all these years in vain for news till the last, convinced that her hero would somehow miraculously reappear victorious. Even after all hope might have been abandoned, she still longed to know his fate and that of the expedition which could not fail. Had he not met a glorious death, having achieved his objective? According to Ken McGugan in his foreword to Ray's Arctic correspondence, to blame Lady Franklin for Ray's discredit is a distortion of the truth. McGugan lays the blame at the feet of Charles Dickens, and from the evidence which he quotes, he's probably right. Well, be that as it may, to disentangle the true story from the plethora of conflicting accounts of what happened would be impossible in the space of one evening. But three things are certain. While John Ray did eventually receive the £10,000 reward which the British government had offered for news of the Franklin expedition, he was never accorded the knighthood he so richly deserved for his work in Arctic exploration, nor was he given the credit at the time for discovering the waterway to the south of King William Land, later named after him. Ray Strait was the final link in the long sought-after Northwest Passage, the holy grail of Arctic exploration. Ray had wanted to prove the existence of this link in 1855 by sailing through it himself in a small schooner, the Iceberg, a vessel he had built at his own expense in Canada. Unfortunately, she was wrecked in a storm in the Great Lakes, so he never had that personal satisfaction. What sheer bad luck for poor Ray. In spite of Ray's discovery of the strait which now bears his name, it was only 50 years later, in 1905, long after his death, that he was finally vindicated. The Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen successfully navigated Ray Strait and reached the Bering Strait, the first European to do so. The whole story of the fate of Sir John Franklin's expedition is reminiscent of a Greek tragedy. While all who took part in the expedition itself and in the searches for information as to its fate did so with devotion and enthusiasm, the whole enterprise was doomed from the start by a combination of a succession of misunderstandings, miscalculations, prejudice, bad luck, and in the end, simply bad weather. In 2012, my sister, Jane Morph, was the first woman to make the entire journey from east to west through the Northwest Passage in the company of David Scott Cowper in Polar Bound, a vessel specially built for polar navigation. They did not, however, navigate Ray Strait, apparently, but negotiated the Bellot Strait, which separates Somerset Island from the Boothia Peninsula to the north of Ray Strait, a route which would have been impassable in Ray's time due to ice. Today, thanks to global warming, there are 6 navigable routes through the maze of Arctic islands, and in the summer, even cruise ships can pass through Ray Strait. Whether that is a good thing or not, I leave you to decide. Ray's involvement in the search for Franklin ended with the discovery of the bodies of the last members of the crews, but a host of others had been involved in the search during the years since the expedition vanished. Many of those are commemorated on the maps with an island, a cape, a bay, a river, or a channel named after them. And this raises an interesting point, I think. All these locations have been named by and for Europeans for inclusion on European maps. Nobody seems to have thought of asking the Inuit whether they already had names for them, an observation which of course would apply to almost anywhere discovered, in quotes, and perhaps colonized by Europeans. I think that's arrogance. But I digress anyway. While all the protagonists in this tale of tragedy and heroism are long since departed to higher things, the story is by no means ended. In the years since the tragedy and Ray's discoveries, there have been countless fruitless searches for the wrecks of the abandoned ships. Success came at last only in 2014, when, partly thanks to global warming and the consequent melting of the polar ice, the ongoing ground searches, analysis of Inuit testimony, the use of modern sonar technology, and sheer good luck, the wreck of the Erebus was finally located, roughly in the area where Inuit oral tradition had indicated that she had sunk. By chance, less than 2 years later, following the sighting of a mast protruding from the ice, the Terror was also quite unexpectedly found, by coincidence, in the bay named after her, Terror Bay. Since that time, the lengthy and difficult process of investigating the wrecks has been undertaken by Parks Canada. The most immediate priority has been to examine the Erebus, who, as she lies in relatively shallow water, is more at risk than Terror from being broken up by ice and strong currents. A considerable number of items recovered from her have been exhibited at the National Maritime Museum in London and in Canada. Did anybody see it? It was a most poignant display. Well, over the years, many theories have been aired in print as to the causes of the tragic failure of Franklin's expedition, but so far they remain speculation. That speculation may now give way to certainty in the foreseeable future, which is very exciting. As part of their investigation of the wreck of HMS Terror, a remotely controlled underwater device has been used by Parks Canada's investigators to obtain video footage of her interior, much of which, including the captain's cabin, is still intact. In his desk may still remain Crozier's log. If, in the future, it can be recovered and is still legible, it might settle at last the question of what went so terribly wrong. That would indeed be a red-letter day. I hope I will live long enough to see it dawn. I keep my fingers crossed. Well, Sir John Franklin is memorialised with a plaque in Westminster Abbey, a statue in Waterloo Place in London, another in Hobart, Tasmania, and a third in the main square in Spilsby, his birthplace in Lincolnshire. All these memorials were erected in the course of the 19th century. John Ray is buried here in Kirkwall and reposes in effigy in St Magnus Cathedral. It was only in 2011 that a blue plaque was affixed by English Heritage to the house in London where he spent his last years. In October 2014 only, a plaque dedicated to him was, very belatedly, installed in Westminster Abbey. Here, in Orkney, in his hometown of Stromness, on the 200th anniversary of his birth, Ray was most fittingly commemorated by the unveiling of his statue on the pierhead, whence he gazes out into the Atlantic. The plinth is inscribed, as you will no doubt know, Dr. John Ray was born in Orkney at the Hall of Clestrain. He became an explorer with the Hudson's Bay Company, learning from the native people how to survive in the Canadian Arctic. He led 3 of the 4 expeditions in which he took part, travelling 3,645 miles on foot and 6,700 by boat, tracing 1,765 miles of unknown Arctic coastline. In 1854, he discovered Rae Strait, the last link in the first navigable northwest passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and the demise of the ill-fated Franklin expedition. A fitting tribute to a great and humble man. And so ends this epic tale of hope, heroism, disaster and despair, misunderstanding, prejudice, lack of communication, bad luck and blind fate. As I said, a fitting plot for a Greek tragedy. But in spite of it all, John Ray's unsurpassed achievements in Arctic discovery remain his most enduring monument. And on the 212th anniversary of his birth in this his own country, we give him due honour once more today. Thank you.
Dr. Dr. Rawnsley, thank you very much for such an informative and emotional talk tonight. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure others of our audience have learned facets of the Ray story that they weren't aware of. I know you'd love to answer a few questions, but first, can the John Ray Society present you with a brooch, silver brooch? And that is taken from...
how lovely.
Oh, I've left the price in there. Just get that off. It's not very much.
I'm not looking.
That is taken from John Ray's actual snowshoe in Stromness Museum.
Oh, yes. Oh, how lovely. If you can see it from there, but isn't that beautiful? Can you see it? It looks like a snow. It is. It is indeed. I can see a snowshoe, but it might be a little bit small for me to try navigating in the snow, yes. Even if I wasn't so crippled. But thank you very much.
But I'll thank you and open to questions, and afterwards we'll draw the raffle around refreshments. Thank you.
Anybody like to ask me a question? Which I probably won't be able to answer, but if you have anything you'd like to say or anything, anybody? Nobody brave enough to speak? I think not. Well, thank you all very much indeed for your attention and for... Yes, I won't be able to hear you, so perhaps someone can convey the...
We've got a lady here who wants to ask a question.
There's a microphone coming for you.
There we go, that's you live. Can I ask, did Lady Franklin ever visit Robert Rendell in Westray? Do you know?
Sorry, I can't hear the question.
Oh, hang on.
Can we do anything with the sound? If you use it a wee bit closer to your mouth, I'll pick it up.
Yeah. Did Lady Franklin ever visit Robert Rendell in Westray to ask him to join a search party?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. Does anybody know the answer to that?
It's recorded in his obituary that she visited him in Westray.
Right. Well, the trouble is that if you haven't got... Well, if it's perhaps that's true, then I don't know. But the trouble with all this sort of thing is that if we don't have the primary sources to refer to, this is the first lesson of research. If it's written in a book or in a newspaper or something, that is not necessarily a primary source. And somebody writes it down, somebody else quotes it, and so on and so on and so on. And what began as speculation becomes fact. And so I have been criticised for not agreeing to say, for example, that that John Franklin spent his last night having dinner with John Ray's family, because as far as I'm concerned, I have been unable to trace any primary source evidence to that. So everything that I have said to you this evening is actually not speculation, but based on primary source material. Anybody else want to say anything? I'm sorry I can't answer your question. I don't know. Yes.
There we go. If you just hold it quite close to your mouth.
Yeah, when Franklin led the expedition, could you say something about how he was chosen as the person to lead the expedition? He presumably had to lobby on his behalf to be chosen, or there would have been others wanting to do...
Everybody did, you see, because it wasn't what you knew, but who you knew would get you the job. So influence. It was a question of influence. And so I don't know. I think it was probably his wife who had encouraged him, but also he had a bad time in Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land, when he was governor of Van Diemen's Land. Because he was a bluff sailor man, he couldn't cope with the politics and the backbiting and all the rest of it. And so I think he was thankful to go back to the Navy and to be chosen for such an expedition. And I believe that the Arctic, has anybody been there? No. Well, the Arctic is apparently is a bug, and once you get it, you can't keep away. So I hear. So the answer is I don't know, but I think he wanted to go back, and so he was probably quite glad to have the chance. But of course, the irony of all this is that if the expedition had come back and found the Northwest Passage, then everybody would have been very pleased. But it was the fact that he died and there was no trace of his expedition at all was found, that it became a cause célèbre, and that we still, an enormous amount has been written about it since then, and the searches for him and all the rest of it. But otherwise, he just would have been another half-pay sailor who had got a job, got a command. So it's quite ironical, really, in that respect. Does that answer your question?
They have never found Franklin's body, have they? I mean, how many of the lost men have they actually found? I remember seeing once a man called Peter Torrington, seeing him in a National Geographic magazine, his actual body that they'd found there in the Arctic that was from one of the ships. But how many, have they never found any of the bodies of any of the men?
Yes, there have been one or two graves have been discovered.
That's what I meant, actual
and
graves.
One of them has been identified, who it actually was, because he had a rather distinctive shape of his jaw, and one of the letters that was written to a member of the expedition beforehand, they were all published in a book which is called May We Be Spared to Meet on Earth, which was put together by one of my cousins and some other people. Very interesting letters which were sent to members of the expedition and then were returned undelivered, of course. So it's extremely interesting, and they have been able to identify this man because of the shape of his jaw. But I think there has been someone has suggested, which I think is possibly an interesting idea, that Franklin, because he died while things were still relatively okay, they're still on board ship and so on. What of, we don't know. But they might, as was done with Nelson, have pickled his body in a cask of rum. And if it might even one day be found in the wreck of the Erebus. Yes. Who knows? It would be so exciting to know if it was. Some of you will probably still be alive when it is, but I doubt if I will.
Oh. Have you grown up all your life, I mean, knowing about Franklin, obviously being a member of your family or whatever, been interested in this? Has it always been something that you've studied and looked at?
Sorry, I couldn't.
Have you always been interested in studying the history of
what happened to Franklin?
Well, yes, because in my family, Franklin is a name that everybody's called something or other Franklin. In fact, my son is John Franklin, and my father was Conrad Franklin, and so there's always been a great interest in Franklin and his family, all the way down through the family. Probably again because he disappeared without trace. It's always a mystery, as I said at the beginning. Everybody loves a mystery, and and there are John Franklins all over the place. I think there's some even in Australia. So yes is the answer to your question. Anybody else?
There might be another question, but first, before I forget, I would like to thank all the online people who've been watching us tonight and listening, and I hope you've all enjoyed this evening's talk. And now back to questions, if there are any.
I'm fascinated by the dotted line on the map.
I think it says what it is, and it was the only map we could, between us, find which actually shows the extent of all these islands, and of course the grey spaces are the Arctic Ocean, the Arctic Sea, but they would mostly be filled with ice. So, and that line has nothing to do with Franklin. It's something. The legend of what it was to do with is off the screen, but it's nothing to do with Franklin. But it was the only map we could find to give you a rough idea of the huge distances involved. huge distances.
Can you indicate on the map the navigable route that we're describing in this story?
Well, not really, but I think Ray Strait is somewhere here, isn't it? I think. Yeah, I think that's Ray Strait there, to the south of Victoria Island, on that map. But of course, it looks easy when you look at a map like that, where the sea is nice and grey. But if it's full of ice, it's very difficult. But I don't know what people think about this business of cruise ships and people sailing through and rowing through and doing this, that, and the other. It seems to me to be desecration of one of the last wildernesses on Earth. It seems to me a bit of a shame. But anyway, that's my personal opinion. Anybody else want to say anything? Yes.
Sorry, can I just pass that over?
Did Franklin and Ray ever meet?
Sorry, could you just repeat that?
Not that I am aware of. They may have done. He probably knew of Franklin may have known of his existence, but of course, until he was given this last command, he was out in Van Diemen's Land, and so he wouldn't necessarily have known Ray. But his wife, she was his second wife, she got to know the Ray family, because she was coming up to Orkney all the time to try and get some news, poor woman. But I think really it's a bit of a shame that she's been considered to be the villain of the piece, because she wasn't really. If anybody was in that position, you would always be clinging to last hope, wouldn't you, that your husband would somehow or other, just by magic, as a miracle, praying for a miracle, that he would actually reappear one day. And it's so easy nowadays to forget the difficulties of communication when all these people in North America who've been listening to us this evening, and elsewhere, and you can get on the end of your phone or your Facebook or whatever it is, and speak to people on the other side of the world, as easy as anything. But in those days, the communication was so difficult. Ray had to come back to England to make his report to the Admiralty. And it was so terribly sad that his report was leaked like that. Some idiot sent it to the Times. And otherwise, perhaps he would not have been vilified to the extent that he was. It's most unfortunate. The whole thing, as I said, is a plot for a Greek tragedy. Somebody just has to write it now. Anybody else? No, I think there's lots of good things waiting at the back of the room. So thank you all for your attention.